Hello and welcome to episode number 266 of Something About the Beatles podcast. And it is a return visit from author Robert Rosen, who you know from his 2000 book, Nowhere Man. That is, it was first published in the year 2000 and just recently republished. And this is good news for people who haven't already picked up the book. A bunch of new material has been added to the book. Some postscript stuff, a new introduction. So the book has been fleshed out from the earliest edition of it with some new ancillary material, which we will talk about in this episode. And I would also like to point out to anybody interested, anybody that is in the St. Louis, Missouri area of the United States, he has an upcoming author appearance, which is a very rare thing. And it is his first post-COVID, I believe. And it will be on October 4th of this year at a place called Subterranean Books in St. Louis. I believe it's supposed to start at 6 p.m. local time. You may want to check with Subterranean Books to confirm that. But in any event, he will be in person, presumably doing a reading, perhaps. I can't really say what the itinerary is going to be, but definitely answering questions. So if you're a SAPI listener in the St. Louis area, you may want to check that out. Anyway, we had a discussion recently that you're about to hear, talking about some of the new material and just things going on in Lennon world. He had not seen the May Pang film as of this conversation, but we'll probably see it later in October when the rest of the world does. It will be coming out on Blu-ray October 13th. I believe it's going to be on a streaming platform and possibly also one night only in some big screen theaters on October 13th. So look for that. I am hoping to have May back on the show. She told me as much when we met earlier this year when she was doing her photography tour. So there's a lot more to talk about that we did not get to talk about in that first initial conversation. So hopefully it'll be happening soon. Now, one of the things we did talk about here, we talked a little bit about John's death, which I know is not most people's favorite subject, but it is something that I've got a great deal of interest in purely in forensics terms, because it never sat very well with me, the official explanation. There was too many things I'd researched that led to questions if the official version was all there was to know about it. We touched on a little bit here, but I will give you listeners a heads up about a book and I guess a documentary as well, if you don't already know this. There's a guy who's a TV producer in England who's been researching it, and he's got a book and doc coming out this year, and his name is David Whelan, Whelan. And I'm going to try to get him on the show. But I'm very curious about his work, which investigates the shooting, and essentially his conclusions are that it didn't happen the way we were told it did. Now, I'm not a person to get all conspiratorial and fake news and everything you know is wrong. I'm not that person. But where it applies, I'm absolutely open-minded and will listen. And if the evidence is there that is unimpeachable, if there's some solid data to rely on and not, well, this guy remembered 50 years later this, or, that's the kind of stuff that interests me, because ultimately with SAPI and my work, I want to get the history right and not put out things that I don't know to be true or that I wish to be true in this post-Aaron Webber world that we live in, where we rely on solid data for things. So that's something that, for those who are interested, that will be up and coming. So now you've got that on your radar. But in the meantime, my conversation with Robert Rosen on the new publication of Nowhere Man with new material and an upcoming visit, an appearance to St. Louis at Subterranean Books, October 4th. 10-4, easy to remember.
The whole Lennon thing started happening. That was 1979, and I was 27 years old. So this is something that's been part of my life from 1979 until today and ongoing. And if you had asked me in 1979, when Fred first started working for Lennon and he came to me with the idea that someday we got to do a book, if somebody said, you think you'll still be talking about this in 2023 when you're 71 years old? I said, no. 2023 when I'm 71 years old. And another thing about that, all these years of thinking about this, and I mentioned it in the new introduction, that what was Lennon doing with his diaries? Why was he keeping the diaries? This had to be more than a creative exercise. And in the past couple of years, it struck me that the diaries were a rough draft of a tell-all memoir that he probably wanted to write and obviously never got the chance to complete. At this point, all these years later, that's what I think the diaries were, a rough draft of the tell-all memoir that Lennon never had a chance to complete.
It's interesting that he documents with great minutia his life during that period where there's not a whole lot happening. It would have been interesting if he started to recount his history, which is fascinating, going back to Liverpool and then to Hamburg and then Beatlemania and all that stuff, getting his take, because generally anytime he was interviewed, and unless it was during the quote-unquote lost weekend, he's pretty down on anything to do with the Beatles, starting with Lennon Remembers and ending with the David Sheff interview in Playboy. It's like if Yoko's next to him, he's going to downplay and basically piss all over any part of his history that she wasn't involved in.
Maybe this is what he really wanted to write about. Maybe he thought this had the best commercial potential because he had stopped talking to the press for 5 years. And maybe he was just thinking commercially. He didn't say at some point, I'm going to publish this. But when you pulled everything out of there and put it together in a coherent form, and yeah, it was really fragmented. This is quite a story, the true story of what John is thinking about and doing in the years when he had totally dropped out of society, really, and just became a bit of a recluse. Not a total recluse. It's not like he never left the house, but he was secluded and he just spent a lot of time with his own thoughts, recording his dreams, that kind of thing. And in the back of his mind, he must have thought that this material has commercial value. And if I want to publish this, I could probably get a really nice deal. He had written that manuscript that became skywriting by word of mouth. And he didn't go forward with that because the thing was kind of avant-garde and he just thought it would be difficult to get a deal and people weren't going to want to read it. But if he's like putting down his thoughts about McCartney all the time and his thoughts about Jagger and that kind of thing, of course people are going to want to read that.
What I marvel at is just the dedication and discipline in sustaining it for as long as he did. Because as you say, writing is laborious. It takes effort and most people don't have that. What I was going to ask you is, you must have heard the audio diary that he did in September 79.
First thing I remember is a nightmare. There's only 3 bedrooms upstairs, one in the front on the street and one in the back, and one teeny little room in the middle. This is boring, I can't be bothered doing it. Let's think of something else.
You might not remember this now, but I'm wondering if he also wrote in his journals that same day. Documented the same day, he's talking into a tape recorder, and then he also wrote this down. Is there anything like that that ties to it?
There was no mention in the journals of the audio diary. From what I remember about that tape, and I did have that tape, I played it, and he was talking and the stuff about his mother and the sweater and all that. At a certain point, he sounded like he was getting bored doing this. It really struck me that the audio diary was a one-off kind of thing, that he just couldn't maintain the verbal energy. And it was just somehow different writing in a notebook every day in those New Yorker magazine diaries that he was able to maintain. It's not like he did a couple of thousand words every single day. A lot of it was, this is what I had for breakfast. And then I ate too many cannolis and had diarrhea. There was a good part of that. But then there were the times where he felt inspired and he would just dash off 1,000 words. And then there was the period where the diaries became dream diaries. And that seemed to take an incredible amount of discipline to program the dreams. And then as soon as he woke up and it was still fresh in his mind, he would get the dream down in just unbelievable detail. It was a dream diary more than a real life diary. at that point in his life. He was enjoying his dreams more than he was enjoying his real life.
Wow. You may say he's a dreamer, but he's not the only one.
Yeah.
Wow, that's fascinating. It's counterintuitive that you would find it more laborious just to talk into a tape recorder because he was such a talker. Once you got him going, you could barely stop him. And writing is laborious, but that, for whatever reason, was preferable, apparently, for John than talking into a tape recorder.
Yeah, if you listen to it, I think at a certain point, you could start to hear the boredom in his voice. And maybe he needed a live person there, that he didn't feel that way with the writing. I don't know. I mean, I do it every day still. That at the point I started transcribing the diaries, I had been keeping my own diary. Let's see, this was 1981. I had started keeping a diary around 1977, and I wrote in it every day. I thought I was pretty disciplined. And I saw this. No, this guy is being even more disciplined about it than I am, especially with the dream diaries. And I tried doing that for a while, and it was hard because dreams are harder to describe than real life because they're not real. And like these fantastic things happened where you almost have to invent a new language to describe it. And he seemed very fluent in that.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. It would have been cool to see where he took it. Are you sustaining your journaling?
Yeah, I do it every day. And the reason why I had sat down to write my first book in 1975, 1976, that was a book about my experiences at the Pentagon. And I had kept an audio diary. So the first thing I did was transcribe the audio diary. But before I actually sat down to start writing the book, it's like, all right, I'm going to sit down. I'm going to write my first book. I just finished graduate school and it was time to write a book. And I had stopped writing for several months and I sat down to write the book. I realized that I was rusty, and the hardest thing was to get a book going when I hadn't written for months. It was just really hard. And when I finished that book in 1977, it wasn't published. I had excerpts published in different magazines, but not the whole thing. I said I could never stop writing again because it's just too hard to get started once you stop. So from that point on, from like 1977 until this morning, I have been writing in my journal virtually every day just as a way to keep words flowing. And Beaver Street, I had kept the journal the whole time. And I was able to base large portions of that book on the journal. And the journal is the roughest draft of what eventually becomes a book. I just keep doing it because in graduate school, I was studying with the writer. Her name is Francine Duplessis Gray. She's written many books. Her probably best known one is a biography of the Marquis de Sade. She told me that if you want to be a writer, you have to keep a notebook and write in it every day. I took that to heart. I wanted to make writing as natural as breathing. So these days, I get out of bed in the morning, I sit down in my notebook and I write something, and I'll write more later. And just over the course of the day, I'll write down stuff in the book. Some of it is ideas for things I'm writing. Other things are just like what I did that day. You know, like today I worked on chapter 13 and I was writing about the aftermath of the Nixon landslide. You know, that's what you'll see in my journal today. That's what I was working on before I spoke to you. And that's why I keep a journal.
And you do go back and look at them?
I go back and look at them when I'm writing about something that I wrote about when I was keeping a journal. That when I'm writing about OP, the college newspaper I was talking about, I was not keeping a journal at that time. That was before I started keeping a journal. The first journal I ever kept was when I was hitchhiking through Europe in the summer of 1972. And I was like going through a Jack Kerouac phase. And I just decided that when you're on the road, the thing to do is keep a journal. So I did that. And that does play into the thing I'm writing now. that I look over that journal and some of it scares me. It's like, don't get into that car. But I got into that car and
Oh, jeez.
I live to talk about it. Then the latter part of the book, like the 1978, 1979, when I was involved with the topless dancer who was the editor of OP, that I was keeping a journal through that, and I've got it down day by day. I had mentioned earlier that Ono had given my journals to the DA, and I eventually got most of my journals back just as Nowhere Man, the first edition, was going to press. But there was certain journals that were missing. And at first, I was kind of mystified by what was in here that they didn't give them back to me. What I realized was in the summer of 1979, I had a ghostwriting job where I was hired by a former New York City cop to ghostwrite a book for him and to get background information for the book. This cop, I'm not going to mention his name, I'm not going to mention any of these people's names because they're cops or they were cops. And he introduced me to all his cop friends, many of whom who were still on active duty. And I would go over to the guy's house and there'd be all these cops there and I'd be interviewing them. And these cops, I was sitting around with these cops doing drugs, snorting cocaine. And that is what vanished. Those are the notebooks that vanished when they were given to the DA, the ones where I name names and tell exactly what drugs I was doing and where I was doing them. And I suspect that they were just destroyed because they didn't want it to get out that all these cops were sitting around doing cocaine.
So you never got them back?
No, I never got them back. I think it had nothing to do with Ono. I think it had everything to do with the police department.
Right. That makes sense. Wow. Crazy stuff.
Yeah, that's the story of my diaries.
Wow.
The copyright case from 2002.
That was after the Lennon box, the anthology box came out, right? And
Right.
he cracked that door open to go after her, which I thought was an act of pure insanity.
Right. You know, she let him get away with publishing his book. And the book was out there. It came out the early 90s, 90, 91. And this was 2002. And we talked about this on the previous show. I'm not sure if he only threatened to sue her or he actually sued her. And when that happened, she went after him. And that's when I became a prime witness in the case. And that was around the time that I had finally, after 18 years, gotten the deal for Nowhere Man. And her lawyers contacted my lawyer and I spoke to them for hours. And, you know, they asked me questions. I answered the questions honestly. They wanted me to testify in the case. And what my testimony was essentially, I told the story that I told in the chapter of Nowhere Man called John Lennon's Diaries. I told the story under oath. If I didn't want to cooperate, they were going to subpoena me. They subpoenaed me anyway. I really had no choice. And I went into court and I told the truth. That's what I did. And the thing was that because this happened simultaneously with me finally getting the deal for Nowhere Man, was that it was never spoken, but I think it was understood that if they started giving me a hard time with Nowhere Man and they tried to shut the book down, that I was not going to be a cooperative witness. And they didn't do that. And you know, I just made things as easy as possible. They had questions. I answered their questions.
But you gave them what they needed. Everybody was happy, ultimately.
Yeah. Everybody was happy. They never interfered with Nowhere Man. And the trial ended up happening just as the paperback was being published. The hardcover came out in 2000. The paperback came out in 2002. This happened simultaneously, and it was all over the tabloids. It was in the New York Times, too. It was a trial, but for me, it was an amazing promotional opportunity. And the reason that the trial was delayed so long was because Seaman was having trouble finding an attorney. And he finally found one who was willing to work on the case, but they had to wait till he passed his bar exam.
Oh, geez.
So this was this guy right out of law school who was up against a team of, at the time, $600 per hour lawyers who had been preparing for years, knew what they were doing, had the law and the facts on their side. And when I was on the stand and Seaman's attorney was going to cross-examine me, his first question was, "Did you burglarize Fred Seaman's apartment?" And I just, what? No.
You got it exactly backwards.
Yeah. And he saw that I was just like, I must have had this, "you got to be kidding" expression on my face when he asked the question. And he said, "Am I the first one who ever asked you that question?" And I said, "Yeah. Nobody ever asked me that question before." Seaman must have really believed that Yoko had told me to burglarize his apartment. And that was insane.
What's always struck me as insane is whether he filed a lawsuit or threatened one. Why would you do that, having skated this far along with your book published against somebody who's going to outlawyer you any day of the week? What did you think was going to happen? What was your end game here?
That's obviously a question for Seaman. I don't think he was thinking clearly. I don't think he was able to envision what the cause and effect was going to be.
That's crazy. I'm not nearly that close to law, but this is not a good idea. It would be the first thing to pop in my head, but it's crazy. The May Pang film, apparently, they've set a date, October 13th, for that.
Oh, okay. Well, soon enough.
Yeah, when we last had our exchange, I didn't know, but it was announced that's when the Blu-ray is supposed to drop. That deal has been swung, so that's good at long last.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll finally get to see that. It was at the Tribeca Film Festival, I guess a year ago. And I just figured it'll be streaming somewhere. I'll catch it when it's streaming.
Yeah. Now, you haven't seen it yet, obviously, so we really can't talk about that. But for the people who have, there are insights in your book, in Nowhere Man. What can you tell us about May Pang and as far as what John's thoughts were that he documented?
John appeared to be, based on what I read in his diaries and what I wrote in the book, he appeared to be in love with May Pang, that he carried a torch for her till the day he died, that the diaries pick up in 1975, January 1975, when he had not gone back to Yoko. He was still with May Pang, and he thoroughly enjoyed being with her. She was an easy person to be around. They had a nice sexual relationship, which John documented in detail and which I wrote about in some detail in Nowhere Man. She got along with Julian. And then one day he decided to go back to Yoko. I read her book about it a long time ago. And it was like, I don't remember exactly what the story was about why he went back.
The hypnotist to quit smoking?
Yeah, something like that. You know, there was nothing like that in Lennon's diaries. The story just didn't quite make sense to me. And, you know, he went back to Yoko, and the whole time he was with Yoko, he was always sneaking off to see May Pang. And he couldn't do it very often, you know, for the usual reasons that married men have a hard time sneaking off to see their mistresses. And he treasured that time. He really cared for her. He really liked being with her. Like I say, they had a nice sexual relationship. And he said in the diaries, and I mentioned this to some degree in Nowhere Man, that, you know, he implied that one of the reasons he left Yoko and went off with May was because he wanted more sex and he wasn't getting it from Yoko. And gee, I'm sure when somebody from the Ono camp listens to this, they will not be thrilled with what I'm saying right here. But yeah, this is what I wrote about in Nowhere Man. And I don't think you could really understand John's relationship with Yoko unless you understand the details of his relationship with May. And that is what I say in Nowhere Man, that he was like always looking for ways to get away from Yoko and be with May. And the last time they saw each other was when a mutual friend of theirs, whose name slips my mind at the moment, was in the hospital, and they met in his hospital room, and their friend took a walk and, left them in the room by themselves. And, he would continue to send her postcards. I believe when he was in South Africa, he sent her a postcard, and, he missed her and he thought about her a lot.
Yeah, I was curious about that because that was rather late. It was end of June or end of May, something around then in 1980, the South Africa trip right before he goes to Bermuda, as you say. And I'd wondered if he'd kept her in the loop at all about going back to recording, if he'd mentioned it to her in any communications privately that he was making an album and this was going to be the narrative, and sort of explain that, because from her telling, he had said to her, look, I'm going to have to characterize our time as a lost weekend, and it's just for the public. We know the truth, and this is what I'm putting out there. So I'm just giving you the heads up. This is what I'm saying, but don't be too bothered by it.
I'm not bothered by it. I know what I read in the diaries, and I assume that what he wrote about it was true. There was nothing in the diaries where he was communicating with May about what was going to be on Double Fantasy. In fact, at the time that he started recording and planning Double Fantasy, he had pretty much stopped writing in the diaries, other than very brief notes like off to the recording studio, that for the first time since he started keeping the diary, that he was occupied with work. And keeping a detailed diary is an extremely time-consuming process, and he just clearly didn't have time for it anymore.
Yeah, that's a good point for anybody who hasn't read your book yet, and I hope they do pick it up, because now there's this wonderful expanded version of it for people to not only get the original book, but all these updates and appendices that have been added to it. So that alone makes it a timely purchase at this point. It's as up-to-date as can be. But you talk in there, just the fact that his journal keeping was so incredibly laborious and detailed, almost bordering on obsessive. And then come the summer of 1980, August, when he starts working Double Fantasy, it's very scant, because clearly he's directing all his energy into recording at that point. To sustain what you did for 5 years in terms of great detail, these journals and all the revelations that come from that, the obsession with the occult, the obsession with McCartney, his following that particular astrologer, I can't remember his name right now.
Patrick Walker.
Yeah, the Patrick Walker horoscopes, yes, that he would gauge the accuracy of, which ended up being quite accurate. But yes, there's Charlie Swan, who was his personal astrologer, who ended up writing the book as John Green on Dakota Days. That kind of stuff, the endless McCartney obsession, and how, despite his public pronouncements otherwise, come the round of interviews for Double Fantasy, I don't pay attention to Paul, I don't pay attention to the Stones, I don't pay attention to Dylan. Of course he did, obsessively, especially Paul. We got the notes to Fred Seaman, the to-do lists that direct him to go out to buy the latest Wings records when they were dropping. So all that stuff's pretty well chronicled, the private John versus the public John.
One more thing about Charlie Swan, John Green, who actually I found out not that long ago from Mike Tree that he died. This was some time ago, but Charlie Swan was primarily a tarot card reader, not an astrologer.
One more thing that per the song God, he didn't believe in, except he did.
Right. Everything he sang on God that he didn't believe in, he believed in.
Right. What is interesting, going through his private pronouncements, as contrasted with the public ones, is how he apparently expressed he thought Double Fantasy was a mediocre record. and he was surprised where he was seeing mostly in America laudatory things being said about them or Rolling Stone ranking it in the top 10 of the year in his lifetime.
Yeah, he said that he felt that Double Fantasy was a mediocre album, and he lamented the fact that, quote unquote, he could never be hot again like Springsteen of the Cars.
And that there were songs he knew to be good that were left off because he had to fit the narrative they decided upon, the whole family and domestic bliss and all that stuff that didn't fit that, like Serve Yourself.
Right. That's the prime example, or I Don't Want to Face It.
Yes.
Or Borrowed Time, actually. Yeah, I guess Borrowed Time really wouldn't fit. And the tragedy is that he never really finished recording those songs, even though they came out on the next album posthumously, Milk and Honey. And I was really disappointed the first time I listened to the LP because, it seemed like what was on the demo tapes was better than what ended up on the LP, especially the acoustic ones when it was just him and his guitar and his voice.
Took such a leading role in completing the album that he had sort of just backed away from it once he'd recorded his stuff, leaving her to oversee the mixing and mastering.
On Double Fantasy.
Yeah, right.
Well, he was doing the mixing and mastering. What she did was she completed it, at a certain point, well into the process, he dropped out and let her finish it. And he noted in his journal that he was really surprised that she did a good job. And, he couldn't have done a better job himself. So he was happy with it. But for Milk and Honey, he was gone. And I don't know, it just strikes me as a weak album.
With the exception of Nobody Told Me, which does come off as a fully finished song, the others absolutely sound like works in progress.
Yeah.
What comes up in his lifetime, again, as talked about in your book and in the journals, is their disenchantment with Jack Douglas before the album was finished over business stuff, the 3% versus 5% of royalties he was supposed to get, and that they're floating working with Phil Spector next time out, which is in fact what she does do for Season of Glass.
Yeah, the thing with Jack Douglas, I know Jack Douglas was going around saying that Lennon had told him that after this, we're going to get the Beatles back together. And my impression, based on what he wrote in the diaries, was that if Lennon did in fact tell Jack Douglas about getting the Beatles back together, that he was telling Jack what he thought Jack wanted to hear. And in the meantime, he was writing in his journals about Jack's playing games and, let's just get through this. And when we're finished, I'll let Yoko deal with him.
Which is, in fact, what happened after John was killed, when Jack Douglas was sort of frozen out of things, leading to litigation, which he ended up winning. But it was definitely this drawn-out battle between them, which I thought it was interesting because we weren't privy to this private stuff, and I thought it only came about after John died. But in fact, they were expressing their issues with him over the very same things during John's lifetime. So it might have played out the same had he not been killed.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
You'd mentioned in the book you're working on now, No Future, tentatively titled, the exploration of John and Yoko rock. Can you go into that further?
Yeah, the book I'm working on now, which, as you say, is tentatively titled No Future, which is a reference to the Sex Pistols and punk and that whole anarchy in the UK. There was just as much anarchy in the USA at the time, is that I went to college at a place called the City College of New York. And at the time I started there, it was open admissions and free tuition. And it was really a remarkable school. I ended up there because when I finished high school, my parents wanted me to study architecture and be an architect.
Was that something you had an aptitude for?
I had won in high school an architectural drawing medal, which I was good at copying things. I had no great architectural imagination. I wasn't a really good freehand drawer, but at City College, it was the only open admissions, free tuition school that had an architecture school. And I went there. I was living in Brooklyn at the time. The school was all the way uptown in Manhattan, in Harlem. It took me an hour and 15 minutes on the subway to get there every day. And the only reason I went there was for the architecture. And I quickly discovered that copying things in high school with a T-square and a triangle and a compass and a French curve was a whole lot different than having to design things, having to do freehand drawing. I couldn't deal with the calculus and the physics. It took me very little time to understand that this was not for me, that what I really wanted to do was be a writer. And at the time, I thought I wanted to be a sports writer. And what I discovered about City College was that they had all these different student newspapers, that there was a straight newspaper that tried to be like the New York Times called The Campus. There was a newspaper for Black students. There was a newspaper for Jewish students, for night school students. There were like a half a dozen different student newspapers. And the one that caught my eye was called Observation Post. And it had been around since 1947, when it was founded by veterans on the GI Bill returning from World War II. And between 1947 and the 1960s, it had kind of mutated or evolved into a radical left-wing rock and roll kind of newspaper. And it would come out every week, every 2 weeks. And I read it. And at a certain point during my freshman year as an architecture student, I realized I was going to drop architecture, switch to writing. And I wanted to join OP because it just seemed like it was such a free-form paper. And people were writing all kinds of crazy, funny kind of things that weren't in the other papers. And at the time, the Vietnam War was still going on. Nixon was president, but things were winding down with the war. That they, in the summer of my freshman year, they had instituted a draft lottery, and no longer every 18-year-old was going to get drafted. That they would pick a lottery number, and if you had a good number, you weren't going to get drafted. That summer, I got a really good lottery number, the kind of number that I wasn't going to get drafted unless Russia, the Soviet Union, swarmed over New York City. That's when I was going to get drafted. That wasn't going to happen. And I had spent the last couple of years of high school really concerned about this, that I was not political at the time, but I knew enough to know that, no, I was not going to go to Vietnam and die for Richard Nixon. It made no sense. The war had been going on forever. It didn't seem like it was ever going to end. And my plan was to stay in college as long as it took, maintain my student deferment, and just wait till the war ended. But in any case, I got the great draft lottery number. And that fall, after getting the great number, I joined OP sometime in like October 1971. And October 1971, the student left, which was really the main force behind OP, they were losing their relevance, their influence, and something was changing. The energy was changing because the war was winding down. It was the very first vibrations of what was not yet called punk. And I was on this newspaper from 1971 as an undergraduate. Later, as a graduate student, I continued working on it. And then in the late 70s, beginning around 1978, when I was out of school and just kind of struggling as a freelance writer, I was still in touch with the people. This is when Fred Seaman was the editor of OP, and actually he was paying me to write an occasional article for them, which he shouldn't have been doing, but he was doing.
So this is before he was working for John.
Oh, yeah. This was 1978 or so. I had met him around 1973, 1974, when I was the editor and he had first joined, and we became friendly. He admired my writing. That was why he gave me all the information, that he admired my writing and he thought I could do a good job with the Lennon material. But in any case, in 1978, I was invited to an OP party where they were introducing the new editor, who happened to be a topless dancer and stripper. And I met her. We hit it off. We started living together. She was the editor of OP. And while she was generating money with her topless dancing and stripping to keep the enterprise going, I was kind of ghost editing the paper for her. And at this point, punk was in full force. It had really become a time of the Sex Pistols album playing constantly in the house, no future. And it just became a newspaper that went from being a left-wing anti-war newspaper with like a strong rock and roll thing going on to a punk tabloid scandal sheet where she was publishing her sexual memoirs and things like that. And I was the ghost editor. The office kind of moved to our apartment in Washington Heights, and we were assembling the paper there. And what was amazing about this whole thing is that when I first joined it in 1971, they were giving us $12,000 per year, which I recently ran through an inflation calculator. And $12,000 in 1971 is the equivalent of almost $90,000 now, $89,000, $90,000. And they let us do pretty much anything we wanted with this money. And from 1971 to like 1977, we did some very outrageous pornographic things. And one of the things that we did when I was still there, when I was the editor, there was a cartoonist. His name is Robert Rosen, and he died a couple of years ago. But he was an artist, a cartoonist, a filmmaker, and he had a thing for the Catholic Church. He was really angry at the Catholic Church, and he drew a cartoon of, as the New York Times would put it, a nun using a cross as a sexual object.
Oh, jeez.
The cartoon caused a huge controversy. James Buckley, who was one of the senators from New York State at the time, the junior senator from New York State, denounced OP in a speech in front of the Senate. And he called for an investigation of OP. This was like all over the media. It was a really big deal. Eventually, the thing ended when the New York Times ran an editorial. They defended us in the name of the First Amendment. The reason this topless dancer joined OP was because she had followed this whole controversy in the press. And her idea was to become the editor and then recreate a live version of the cartoon, which she did. She dressed up as a nun and she used a crucifix as a sexual object. And sometime after they did this, after I was long gone, after we'd broken up, they ran these pictures of her on the cover and in the centerfold. And after all these years of letting OP do anything they wanted, continuing to give us $12,000 per year to spend as we saw fit, this was finally going too far. And they finally pulled the plug after 30 some odd years on OP. And I got to write a story about this for Soho Weekly News. And it was just like a highlight of my career at the time. And this is the kind of thing I'm writing about now, that as in the Chelsea Hotel, you got Sid Vicious murdering his girlfriend and killing himself with an overdose of heroin, that OP has become this punk scandal sheet where, like the Sex Pistols, we were just into outrage for the sake of outrage. And in the book I've been working on for several years now, I've been chronicling this whole thing of how OP went from a rock and roll voice of the student left to a punk scandal sheet. And it's just kind of a distillation of what happened in the 1970s.
And New York is like ground zero of American punk all the while, with the CBGB scene and all that stuff going on with the Ramones and Television and Blondie and Talking Heads and all that stuff. So you're very well placed if that's the magazine you're running, the homegrown version.
Yeah, we were very well placed. I mean, this has very little to do with the book, but I went to junior high school with the drummer from the Ramones, Mark Bell, Marky Ramone. So it just seemed that we were totally tuned in to that punk vibe. And it's a book I've been working on for 3 or 4 years now, maybe more than that. And I guess I'm up to the part now where Nixon in 1972 is reelected in a landslide that he carries 49 out of 50 states, and he beat McGovern by 19 million votes. And yeah, it just seems to me now, as I was writing about this the other day, that it was Nixon's reelection that really launched the no future, nothing matters punk vibe. And that the only response to Nixon at the time was outrage for the sake of outrage. And that's what we did. And it felt right. This is how we expressed ourselves, that, we wanted to be as outraged and anti-establishment and pornographic as can possibly be. And that's kind of a long-winded synopsis of the book I've been working on.
It's interesting to me because it's a very nihilistic response to the reelection of Nixon that you're describing people of a certain mindset, young generations who tend to be skewing left anyway. And you, of course, know what happened election night between John and Yoko. That famous story, his own expression of outrage.
Oh, that was the party at Jerry Rubin's house?
Yeah, something like that.
Or maybe their house on Bank Street. Yeah, I forget, but I know what happened. That was when John went into the bedroom with some woman and he left Yoko there feeling humiliated.
It just aligns perfectly with what you described of do the most outrageous thing out of anger at what the world has become through the re-election of Nixon. It's like, what is the worst possible thing you can do in this moment, John? Oh, this is what you're going to do. That's how you're going to express the same thing that you're describing with young people reacting to the re-election of Nixon. I just find it fascinating that they're in complete alignment.
I had never made that connection between the party with John and the kind of stuff that we were doing, but it's a good point. I had forgotten that party took place on election night. And, like I was telling you in my email suggesting things that we should talk about, there was that one issue that came out, I think it was November 1971, on the front cover of OP. You're looking down the barrel of a gun. When you open it up, on the back cover, they printed the back cover of the Two Virgins album, which, John and Yoko naked. And you got this gun pointed at John and Yoko. And this is 1971. And it just seemed, looking at it now, weirdly prophetic.
Prophetic and horrific.
Yeah. So that was OP. That was where I got my advanced education in rock and roll. That at the point that I started college, I owned maybe 13 record albums and a phonograph that I would play them on. At that point, I started buying stereo equipment, and we got free records to review, and free concerts. And that was where I got totally immersed in the music scene. And I was working side by side with people who were just really, really into it. I was, telling you, there was one guy, Barry Taylor was his name. He's a music manager now. At the time, he was a Who and British rock fanatic. On his summer vacations, he would go to the UK and bring guitars with him, electric guitars, and he would sell those to rock bands there, including The Who and Genesis. And that just seemed like what could be a better business than selling guitars to The Who? And he was doing that. He was writing for OP. He was also writing for the Village Voice. And I was deeply impressed by these people, by this really incisive rock criticism that I had no idea how to write at the time. And, there was another guy, there was this conflict on the staff. Barry Taylor thought that The Who and British rock was where it's at. This other guy, Leo Sachs, who would go on to win a Grammy producing a 9 CD set by Bill Withers. This was, 10 years ago now, but he was an Allman Brothers, Marshall Tucker, the whole Southern rock thing. And, there was just like a constant competition between the two of them about who was greater, The Who or the Allmans. And then there was this third guy, Peter Grad, who was a total Lennon freak, and he would review their albums, and he went down to Times Square to take a picture of The War Is Over If You Wanted billboard. And I probably got more of an education on OP than I did go into class.
It was interesting, the review that you sent me of Imagine, done in real time, that saw it as a step back from Plastic Ono Band. I thought that was an interesting take. I thought that the guy wasn't wrong who wrote it, describing where he seemed to have had this breakthrough on Plastic Ono Band with what he was singing about, that in Imagine he sounds frightened.
Yeah, that these people, for the most part, they really knew what they were talking about. That as I've been working on the book, much to my surprise, they put the entire collection of OPs on the internet from the very beginning in 1947 to the final issues with the Nuns. And I've been reading some of the pop culture criticism, and for the most part, with certain notable exceptions, it stands up. The one notable exception I noticed was that our film critic trashed The Godfather, said it was a terrible movie that would soon be forgotten.
He wasn't talking about Godfather 3.
No, he's talking about Godfather 1, the original
Right.
Godfather. I don't know if I saw Godfather 3.
Yeah, not too many people did. In the new edition, I know a lot of the fans don't like saying the guy's name. I'll just limit it to his last name, Chapman. You write quite a bit about him and his motivation and what took him on the journey that ended the way it did. Now, I'm not a big conspiratorial person unless there's reason to be, as you describe yourself. You talked about JFK and your take on that. That's kind of where I'm at. And I've never was one of these people that bought into the whole Manchurian candidate thing with a programming of Chapman that led him to the Dakota, and it was a political hit. You talk in there about the narrative being put out there that you were the one, people asserting this with a straight face, that you were in the employ of the CIA, that it was you that green-lighted the assassination of John Lennon. You want to talk a little bit about that, because it's so outlandish and outrageous. I don't know how many people know about this, but this was an actual thing.
Yeah, I included some material about that in the new edition of the book. There are a lot of people out there who think I'm a Zionist-funded agent of the CIA who ordered a hit on John Lennon. The first time I saw that was back in 2000, actually in Chicago. I had gone to the BEA that year for the launch of Nowhere Man, and there was a party in a bookstore in Chicago the night before. And I was looking through some books, and I see this book, I think it was called The Covert War Against Rock. And what the book is basically every rock star who ever died prematurely was murdered by the CIA. That's the premise of the book. And I opened to the chapter about John Lennon, and there I am in the chapter saying that I was part of the scheme, this conspiracy. And it was the first time I ever saw anything like that. And yeah, I practically fainted.
Now, to set the timetable for this, your book is just being published, right? You're at BBA for that. And here in an already published book, you're being mentioned. How publicly well-known were you at that time?
It was the Playboy piece. This was back in 1982, 83, when I forgot how it came about. But way back when I first started writing Nowhere Man, I sent the manuscript to a bunch of people, including this guy, Barry Golson, who is the executive editor of Playboy. And I met with him, and he basically strung me along for several months. And he eventually said, well, we can't run your piece. I've assigned it to David Sheff, and he wants to interview you. And I agreed to have David Sheff come to my house.
Okay, to stop for a second, to cut in, if I may. When you approached Playboy, was it in the view of writing for them or to have your book published by them? Because they did have a publishing arm back then that, in fact, published Richard DeLello's book, The Longest Cocktail Party. What were you wrangling for at that moment?
At that point, they no longer had the publishing arm. I was just trying to get a story into a major magazine that I would be able to turn into part of a book proposal, that I just had to get something out there. And I admired Playboy for the journalism. And I sent them the proposal, and I met with them. I met with them on my 30th birthday. I remember that. And they just strung me along for a long time until they finally said that Sheff wanted to interview me. And I had also spoken to Jan Wenner at Rolling Stone, and I had submitted the proposal to some book publishers back in 1982, 1983. I got a number of substantial offers for the book that were withdrawn after they thought about what this actually meant.
And the openness to litigation they might be in publishing it.
Yeah, the litigation was what they were worried about, that I did not have documented proof that everything I was writing about was true. In any case, Sheff came to my house. He interviewed me. I had already met with Ono at this point. Jan Wenner had hooked me up with Ono.
For the sake of your karma.
Yeah, Jan Wenner wanted to save my karma. Jan said, I can't publish this. You need to tell your story to Yoko Ono, which I did. This was after I told the story to Ono. This was after she had me on the payroll. I was no longer on the payroll. In any case, Sheff had interviewed me, came to my house.
And people should know, in case they're not getting this point, David Sheff is the one who interviewed John and Yoko for the Playboy interview, the massive Playboy interview.
Right. He came to my house. He wrote the story with his wife at the time. And when the story came out, I think in March 1983, Playboy, it was a complete hatchet job. I had given Yoko my diaries. We're talking about approximately 500,000 words. A good chunk of it, I was going through my Jack Kerouac phase at the time. I was running teletype paper through an electric typewriter and just pouring like a total stream of consciousness into this day after day, month after month. I was just piling up all these words. I gave all this to Ono because she asked for it, and it was Yoko, and we hope someday you'll join us and the world can live as one. So I joined Yoko. I gave her my diaries. She gave my diaries to Playboy to use as research material for this story. And they obviously went through this 500,000 words, and they cherry-picked about 200 words that made me look terrible.
The damning one being Dead Lennon equals big dollars, which
right.
was put in there to suggest it was your thought for yourself rather than in context it was you commenting on Yoko.
Exactly. Yeah, it was that kind of thing. And I spoke to Sheff, I don't know, for probably 2 hours and, told the whole story. And from this 2-hour interview, they found, I believe, one sentence that they were able to include in the article that matched their storyline. And it was a hatchet job on me, on Seaman, on all the people he was working with.
And make Yoko look like a victim and people just picking at the bones of John Lennon for profit.
Right. And This story, it also ran as the cover story in People magazine. They never spoke to me. It ran in the New York Post. They did speak to me. And I was just talking openly to people. I was very naive at the time. I was naive enough to take Fred Seaman at his word with whatever he was telling me. And I trusted people. I was pretty young. I was in my 20s still.
You lost your job over it.
I lost my job over it. They said they didn't want a criminal in the office. So, yeah, I lost my job. And it was not a good time. They also gave my diaries to the DA's office in New York. And they were threatening to arrest me on criminal conspiracy charges unless I signed a document waiving my First Amendment rights to ever tell the story of what happened to me and what I knew from the diaries. Yeah, again, we talked about this last time. And yeah, I was able to pull this really good criminal defense lawyer out of a hat at the last minute when I really thought I was going to be arrested. And he told the DA that you're in gross violation of my client's constitutional rights. And that was the end of it. I never heard from them. They were obviously banking on the fact that I would not be able to come up with an adequate criminal defense. And they were wrong. You know, this guy, his name is David Lewis. He was a mafia lawyer. He defended people from the mafia. Somebody tipped me off to him. He was really interested. He did it pro bono. He was totally outraged by the way they were trying to steamroll me. It was probably a novelty for him to be defending somebody who wasn't a career criminal, probably wasn't a criminal at all.
This guy's actually innocent.
He did a great job. I never heard from the DA again. And I forgot what got me off on this whole riff.
We were talking about the book that you found that was citing you as part of this cabal with the CIA.
Right. Yes. The Covert War Against Rock by some guy. Yeah. He had based a lot of the chapter on the Playboy article, and he just extrapolated to say this was clearly the work of the CIA. And that's between the Playboy article and this Covert War Against Rock book. A lot of people picked up on this and they embraced this conspiracy theory. And there was one guy whose name I don't remember. He started around 2007, and that he would just put up these websites overnight. They would just mushroom all over the internet. And it was on and on about these conspiracy theories and how I was a CIA person. And, maybe I was the actual gunman who pulled the trigger. This is what they were saying. One of the things that happened after Nowhere Man was originally published in 2000 was that it got translated into a lot of different languages. It got picked up all over the world in all these different languages. One of the places that it really caught on was in Latin America. This was a complete surprise to me. I had no idea that anything like this would happen. In America, in the US, it was published by a small independent publisher called Soft Skull Press. In Latin America and Spain, it was published by Random House, and that made a huge difference. I tell people that the book was perceived in 3 different ways, depending upon what country you're talking about. In America, in the US, Nowhere Man was treated as gossip. It was written about literally in gossip columns. That was the main coverage it got. In the UK, it was treated as journalism. In Latin America, it was treated as literature. And some really remarkable things happened there. I ended up doing 2 media tours, actually 3. I went to Mexico twice. I went to Chile once, and I went to Argentina. That was the most recent one. This was, all before COVID. And you would think I'd written Harry Potter or something. It was just like, in Latin America, everything I'd been working for 25 years had come to pass in a language I didn't understand. Since then, I've made the effort to pick up a little Spanish, but also in Latin America. I mean, one of the reasons that it was so well received there is that they're really into the occult stuff, the magic, the astrology, and the tarot. They embrace that, but they also embrace the idea of conspiracy theories. And they would ask me about conspiracy theories. I would just deny it and say it's insane. But I think the chapter that you're talking about in the new edition of the book was a Q&A with the Mexican newsweekly Proceso. And Proceso is the equivalent of what Time magazine was when people still bought Time magazine. And they asked me about the conspiracy theory, and I refuted it. These conspiracy theories are insane. And the Manchurian candidate thing, to execute that kind of plan, it's just too complex to actually work. And at this date, I am still convinced that Chapman, the assassin, was a mentally ill person who believed that by shooting Lennon, he would disappear into the pages of The Catcher in the Rye, which is what inspired him to kill Lennon. He read The Catcher in the Rye. It struck him as he was reading his autobiography. And one of the big themes in The Catcher in the Rye is that Holden Caulfield hates hypocrites. And Chapman believed that Lennon was a total hypocrite who sings about imagine no possessions when he's got every luxury known to man. And these kind of thoughts just inspired in him a murderous rage, which he was able to carry out. And The Catcher in the Rye ends on chapter 26. He believed that if he shot Lennon, chapter 27, a new chapter would be added to The Catcher in the Rye, and it would be written in Lennon's blood, and he would literally disappear into the book to become the Catcher in the Rye for his generation. And that's just outlandish insanity. And conspiracy theorists cannot accept that this happened. And they just need to come up with some kind of incredibly complex Manchurian candidate CIA plot that explains it, that explains why Lennon was killed. And, I've done a lot of interviews over the past 23 years, more than 23 years. The interviews started even before the book was published. The only person who I've ever turned down for an interview is a conspiracy theorist who was just determined to prove I was with the CIA, that there was no point in talking to him.
Did you find that any of this Zionist conspiracy angle with the death of Lennon, and that is to say that there is numerous conspiracy theories about the death of Lennon, that just happens to be one of them that you're connected to personally, has it gotten any traction? Is anybody buying it?
This one conspiracy theorist, the one whose name I don't recall, the one who started in 2007 and would come up with a new website at least every week, just like these mushrooming websites. Some of his material I saw was picked up by a legitimate Spanish newspaper.
So in Latin America, this stuff is getting disseminated because I never heard of it. I've heard of the various Manchurian candidate conspiracies in America, of course. I never heard of you connected to one until I read it in your book.
Yeah, you were just, beginning in 2007, you weren't looking at the right websites and you didn't read The Covert War Against Rock.
Right.
I did read the book. I bought the book that night. I got to see this. I got to try to figure out what this guy is saying. And I didn't read every single word of it, but I read a couple of chapters. And the guy's logic is just so murky and so hard to follow. The book is almost unreadable. But the book stays out there. It came out in 2000. It's still in print.
And not wanting to make this conversation a commercial for the book, we'll move on because I've not read it, I have not seen it, and I'm not particularly interested in drawing attention to it beyond just the point we made of it being discussed in your book and it being ridiculous on its face. So let's leave it there.
Yeah, and the thing that you brought up before when we did the interview last time, and you got some comments that people were pointing to that one line in the Playboy article by David Sheff, where dead Lennons equal big bucks. And that was just all the proof anybody needed to show that I was not pure at heart. And I've had this thrown in my face now for 23 years. Anytime somebody wants to discredit me, they just read the Playboy article because it's out there.
Yeah. So it was nice that you addressed your letter to Barry that you put in the book as an appendix, because anybody hearing you on the show or seeing your name anywhere that does a Google search will surely land on the Playboy article at some point. And maybe that will be the only thing they read about you, and it will set in their head, and it'll be damning enough that they don't know the context of that article and what it really means and the heavy weight slanted toward a particular narrative that it represents.
Yeah. Oh, and the other thing that feeds into the conspiracy theories is the fact that in 1975, I was a speechwriter for the Secretary of the Air Force. Just because I worked for the government for a few months, again, it's an open and shut case. He worked for the government. He wrote dead Lennons equal big bucks. He did it. That's the logic.
You're recruited.
Yeah. I've written 3 books. The last 2, Beaver Street, A History of Modern Pornography, and A Brooklyn Memoir. They're not about Lennon. And in A Brooklyn Memoir, I touch on the Beatles and the JFK assassination, but they're not about Lennon. After Nowhere Man came out and a lot of people bought it and became a well-known book, my agent said, what you should do now is write a book about Ringo. I don't know why he picked Ringo, but he picked Ringo.
A lot of people think he's Jewish.
Ringo?
Yeah. Did you know that?
No.
There was death threats he got during the Beatles' heyday. We're going to kill the Jew because of his nose.
Oh, God. Again, irrefutable proof.
Right.
I never heard that. No, I just thought they wanted to kill the Beatles because, we're bigger than Jesus. That's why I thought everybody wanted to kill the Beatles. Yeah, religion always comes into it, doesn't it? But first of all, everything I knew of interest about Ringo, I put into Nowhere Man. I had no new information about Ringo. If I was going to write a book about Ringo, which, maybe it would have sold, I don't know, but it would have been a cut and paste job. And it didn't interest me, that I wrote about the Beatles for the time being. I really don't have much more to say about the Beatles, that it's all in Nowhere Man. And over 23 years, I've added all the new chapters that explain a lot of things I didn't talk about in the first edition. But I did not want to be labeled as a Beatle writer, like, somebody who dedicated his life to cashing in on the Beatles. Like, aside from the fact that there was no way I could write another book like Nowhere Man, I was interested in other things that I wanted to write about, that I wanted to spend like years with it. No, I did not want to spend a year or 2 doing a cut and paste job on Ringo or George or Paul. I just had nothing new to add to it. And, there's plenty of people. The other 2 books that people are going to say, oh, he cashed in on John, he cashed in on the Beatles. Go read my other 2 books. I'm not cashing in on the Beatles. I'm not just grinding out one Beatle book after another as certain people have done. And that's all I have to say about that.
I mentioned I have a new book coming out this year.
No, I don't have a new book coming out.
No, I do.
Oh, you do? Oh.
Yeah, as one of those professional Beatle writers.
Yeah, well, that works for you. And nobody's accusing you of knocking off Beatles to make your book more commercial and get attention.
Yeah, so far. I haven't read the news today yet.
Yeah.
I'm just being light here. Because what we're talking about is very heavy.
Yeah, it's, when I first saw it, like I said, I almost fainted. I just kind of felt my knees buckle. I didn't faint. But then when that stuff started in 2007 with the Secretary of the Air Force kind of thing, and that was like all over the internet.
Connecting dots to support this theory.
Yeah, my wife got more upset about it than I did. That I just thought, this is nuts. Anybody with any intelligence is not going to believe this. And that's not necessarily true, that there are a lot of people who seem intelligent who do believe this Manchurian candidate stuff.
Which is one thread of thought, for sure, with absolute validity to it. I personally, and like I said, I'm not a super conspiracy thinker on the killing of Lennon, which is not to say I don't have questions about things. I always have wondered because Chapman confessed there wasn't really much of an investigation. Like, where's the limo driver? Was he ever interviewed? No, there's things about it that are still lingering questions to me, but that doesn't sign me up automatically for some kind of theory. I don't know any more than anybody else does.
The limo driver, you're saying, who drove John and Yoko back from the recording studio to the Dakota.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, that never occurred to me that he might have been involved.
Not that he was involved, but just he was a witness. What did you see? And if there's anything else to know, one of the things that floats is second shooter stuff, which you allude to in your book. I don't know. I'm not even postulating that that's possible. But I have had this conversation with somebody who is the daughter of a career police detective. And she's a big Beatle fan, too. And she says, I never thought the story was as cut and dry as they put it out there. And this is her police-oriented mind thinking. She has a lot more questions. We've talked about it before. I don't claim to possess any more knowledge or insight or questions. But it did strike me as you're taking the explanation they've put out there because he confessed and he was obviously caught, as you say, with the smoking gun. But is it as thoroughly investigated as it might have been? There certainly had to be other witnesses around whose names we don't even know. I would like to know, could you add that to the pile of evidence in the narrative? Is everybody in alignment on this? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. Obviously, there were witnesses. I mean, I went down to the Dakota that night, a couple of hours after it happened, just to take in the scene and thinking it was going to be a part of the book I was going to be working on with Fred. The filmmakers, Alan Parker, one of the people he was working with, they had found some videotape of a guy who lived across the street from the Dakota who had seen it from his window. I had never heard about that. Actually, I said, wow, how'd you find that? I'd never heard of that. And they just said, a lot of research. There's stuff out there.
Well, good to know that people are in the case. That gives me some satisfaction to know that everything that's possible to trace before it's too late is being done.
Yeah, everything that's possible.
Something About the Beatles. Created and hosted by Robert Rodriguez. Executive producer Rick Way. Title song by the Corgis.
I don't think anybody should be that interested in every detail of my life, from Beatles to now. But anybody who claims to have some interest in me as an individual artist, or even as part of the Beatles, has absolutely misunderstood everything I ever said, if they can't see why I'm with Yoko. Right. And if they can't see that, they don't see anything. They're just jacking off to, could be Mick Jagger or somebody else. Let them go and jack off to Mick Jagger. Okay? I don't need it. I absolutely don't need it. Let them chase wings, Just forget about me. If that's what you want, go after Paul and Mick. I ain't here for that. Go play with the rolling wing.